There's a particular kind of suffering that rarely gets talked about openly. It isn't loud, it isn't dramatic, it doesn't look like crisis. Instead, it feels like absence, a quiet hollowness, a sense of being disconnected from yourself. Some people describe it as numbness, others as floating through life, others simply as something missing. And beneath all of these descriptions is often one painful inner negative belief. I don't exist. Not metaphorically, not philosophically, but emotionally, psychologically, existentially. Many of the clients who experience this are highly functional. They work, they parent, they socialize, they succeed. From the outside, everything looks fine. But internally, there is little sense of inner groundedness, no deep feeling of this is me. Instead, life can feel performative, as though they are constantly adapting, managing, presenting, without ever feeling real inside. In my work, I understand this through the relationship between the inner child and the inner critic. The inner child communicates through feelings and body sensations, empty feelings of sadness and anxiety, feeling lost and feeling alone, a weight on the chest, a sensitivity in the gut. The inner critic, however, communicates through language and belief. When someone carries a chronic feeling of emptiness, the inner child is often communicating something deeply painful. Painful feelings arising from experiences of I was not seen, I was not met growing up, I was not held growing up. And over time, the inner critic builds a belief around that experience. I don't really exist. This doesn't come from nowhere. It is usually the result of developmental emotional neglect. Not necessarily abuse, often something more subtle and therefore more confusing. A childhood where the child was perhaps physically cared for but emotionally unseen, where their feelings were not mirrored, where their inner world did not feel important to anyone, where they were praised for behaving, achieving, coping, performing, but rarely known. It's less about what happened in childhood and more about what didn't happen and should have happened for full functioning development growing up. Winnicott wrote about this beautifully when he described the development of the false self. When a child's authentic emotional expressions are not met with attunement, parental attunement, they begin to adapt. They become who they think they need to be in order to remain connected, to stay attached. The spontaneous self slowly retreats into the background. What develops instead is a functional self, capable, polite, perhaps impressive, but disconnected from emotional aliveness. Over time, the inner critic becomes the manager of this survival strategy. It says things like, don't feel too much, don't need too much, don't be too visible, stay in control, remain acceptable. And beneath those rules sits the deeper terror. If you are fully yourself, you will lose connection altogether. So the system prioritizes safety over authenticity, survival over selfhood. This is why emptiness is not a surface issue. It isn't resolved through positive thinking, for example, or affirmations or simple motivation. In my professional opinion, it is misleading to suggest that someone who feels they do not exist simply needs mindset work. This is not a confidence problem. It is a developmental wound. Now, neuroscience supports this understanding. Alan Shaw's work on right brain development shows that our sense of self is formed through early emotional attunement. Dan Siegel describes identity as an emergent process of being seen, soothed, and mirrored within relationship. When that process is compromised, the brain quietly and literally does not build a cohesive felt sense of self in the way naturally would. This is why this work requires depth and often prolonged relational therapy, not because the client is broken, not because they are failing, but because the task is not simply healing something, it is building something that never had the chance to fully form in childhood. The therapy relationship becomes a new developmental environment, a place where the client is constantly seen, emotionally met, psychologically held in mind. Over time, that experience begins to internalize. Slowly, a new inner relationship develops. In inner child terms, the wounded child begins to feel recognized. The inner critic begins to soften, and a new internal presence can begin to emerge. What I call the inner nurturing parent. A part of the self that can hold experience with compassion rather than judgment, with presence rather than pressure, with stability rather than threat. This process is rarely quick. It often involves grief for the childhood that was missed, the self that never got to fully emerge, the emotional needs that were unmet. It can involve fear, a fear of being seen, fear of taking up space, fear of existing more fully. These are not signs of regression. They are signs that something real is finally beginning to grow. And the transformation, when it happens, is profound. Clients don't just report fewer symptoms, they describe feeling real for the first time, feeling located inside themselves, feeling emotionally present in their own lives, feeling that they exist even when no one is watching, that their internal world has substance, continuity, and worth. In my view, this is some of the deepest work therapy can offer. It goes beyond coping, beyond functioning, beyond self-improvement. It speaks to the most fundamental human need, the need to be real, to be known, to be seen, to be here. If you recognize yourself in this, if you've ever felt that quiet emptiness, that sense of disconnection, that question of who you really are, please know that it is not a life sentence. It is not a personality flaw. It is often the echo of a self that was never fully met. And with the right depth of work, with safety, with consistency, with relational healing, that self can begin to emerge. Not as a performance, not as a role, but as something far more powerful, a felt sense of being. And if you'd like help exploring your emptiness, visit my website, book a free discovery call, and let's see what's possible.